Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Colleen is known as the Joyful Vegan. I love that title. That's a wonderful title. Who is really an expert in all nuances of living a more compassionate lifestyle. And in her work, she does a lot to kind of spread that message because everything she does is focused on that path. She's the best-selling author of 7 books that I know of, some of which are Color Me Vegan, Joyful Vegan, Being Vegan, Reflections on a Compassionate Life. And just welcome, Colleen. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Oh, thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
When we go, a lot of times we'll start off because we want people to get to know you a little bit. You coming from the early stages of your life, it's kind of an interesting. I was also born in New Jersey, by the way, just so you know.
I can hear it.
We're Jersey boys and girls, yes, here. But what it was interesting, aside from living in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, you grew up with a father that had ice cream stores. So I could imagine that had to be kind of like, oh my God, Dad's got an ice cream store. You know, I had uncles that ran candy stores in the Bronx in New York, and it was the same kind of thing. I could go in and so talk a little bit about those early steps, because I loved reading about the fact that you addressed the disconnect that happened so early in our lives between really feeling compassionate and kind to animals. I mean, that's how we all are basically as children, and somehow having the disconnect from that to having them on our plates, typically in most of our families when we grew up, and having this remarkable, bizarre dichotomy of, animals that are cool to have as pets and demand our compassion, while others are destined for slaughter and harm. So talk a little bit about that journey through your early years that led to the early stages of your compassionate way of life.
Yeah, I mean, I tell the story of my experience because I think it's universal, and I think most of us can identify with it. I think the desire to be connected to other animals is as natural and normal as you can get. And while there are anomalies, people who, might have psychopathy or sociopathy, I think the norm is to actually be connected to other animals and to see ourselves in them and vice versa. And it's how we come into the world, and we're all encouraged to be compassionate. And I tell the story of how all of us grow up in homes, if we're in, your typical home, where on our clothing, on our wallpaper, on our bedclothes, in all ways, we have these images of animals, usually baby animals, depicted, and we have stuffed animals in our beds, and we are read books, and we're shown films, and we're told stories about animals, and not just about animals, but actually stories that use animals to teach us our most basic social skills, our most fundamental skills like spelling and counting and reading, where animals are used in all of these, children's books and tools. And so in all of these ways, we're seeing ourselves through the lens of animals, and we're also connected with animals, real living animals. And so people, most of us have had the experience of being brought to the zoo, to animals, to see animals. A lot of us grew up in homes with animals. So in all of these ways, we're connected to other animals, and we're encouraged to be so. And we're taught that if we pull the tail of our dog, it's going to hurt. And we're taught to be kind to an animal. We're taught not to hurt them. And even just more, I think, profoundly, we know the research that demonstrates that when a child is kind to an animal, it's a really good sign in terms of emotional development. And if they're unkind to an animal, it's used as a red flag in terms of how they're going to harm themselves, how they're going to harm other animals. And it's a precursor to how they may harm individuals, human beings. So in all these ways, animals are such an integral part of our development and our lives. And what starts to happen is we're also being fed animals. They're on our plates, but they're dismembered. They're not alive. And we're disconnected from that. And we're sure what's happening. We kind of have the sense that there was an animal once. We might call them chickens. We might call them turkeys, right? We know that there's a name for both the living animal and the dead animal. And we're starting to kind of reconcile this connection we have and this compassion we have for animals with this desire for the taste of them and the needs that we're told we need from the animals, all the things. And so what starts to happen, and this is my theory, but what starts to happen is we start to compartmentalize both our compassion for the animals and the use of the animals as well. And so we have this dissonance, we have this discomfort with knowing that we love animals, but also knowing that we've now developed a taste for the flesh and fat of animals, right? And so how do you reconcile the two? How do you reconcile, well, of course I love animals. Of course I don't want to hurt animals. Of course I want to be with my dog. Of course I love cats. Of course, whatever. Of course I want to see that pig. Of course I want to pet that cow. But I love beef and I love pork and I love bacon and I love sausage. How do you reconcile the fact that you know that by virtue of eating sausage, an animal had to be killed and they most likely suffered, if we really are telling ourselves the truth, with I care about animals. Well, what do you do when you have that kind of dissonance? You have to decide how to reconcile that. And the way we reconcile that is either changing our thinking about our behavior or changing our behavior. That's really the two options we have. And so in a society where it is the norm and the status quo to consume animals day in and day out, every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we are in this place of social acceptance. Our families are doing it. It's part of our social engagement now. It's part of parties, it's holidays, it's all of the ways we connect with each other. We cook together, we go out and dine together. And so in all of these ways, we're conditioned, encouraged to go along with the status quo and to kind of quell that compassion and certainly quell that dissonance that is inevitable, because we are compassionate people, because we are good people, because we do care, because we don't want to hurt other animals. And so we go along with the status quo because we are social beings. That is a dominant feature of human beings, is our social aspect, capacity. And so what happens, you just to go along with the status quo and eat the animals, and you kind of quell that compassion. Now it doesn't go away, but it's and so in order to that, and you're making these excuses and you're reconciling, I love animals, but I'm eating animals and I like eating them even though they're hurt. So you change your mind about your behavior and you change your mind about the animals, right? This is a really interesting conversation about how we compartmentalize the animals themselves. They don't feel the same way we do. They're sacrificing themselves for us. They don't have the same capacity to feel or have relationships, right? So we have to tell ourselves all of those things. And one day we have some kind of awakening. We have some kind of revelation. And it's different for everybody. It might be related to health. It might be related to ethics. It might be related to compassion, whatever it is. We see something, we read something, we talk to someone, we see an animal. We have a moment where we go, hang on, and we quite literally kind of have this awakening. And that's that process that I think is very interesting and I think is really universal. Now, we can go our whole lives and never have the awakening, but I would argue that most of us are trying really hard to stay asleep to avoid that awakening, because I don't think it's because we're afraid of not eating animal products. I don't think that's scary for people. I think what's scary for people is the unknown, and that could mean for their social lives and what that means for their nutrients and what that means for all of the ways that we've told ourselves that we have to keep eating animals. And so we all support each other in doing this thing that is the most harmful thing for the animals, the most harmful thing for our health, the most harmful thing for our environment, because that's what we've always done, and because everyone's supporting us in doing that. So it's a very long answer for
No, it's a good answer, but I'm going to counter that because I talk about awakening. We have huge millions of people that never have that awakening. And what I mean by that is it's such a weird and interesting disconnect for me that there's such a difference between thingness and personhood for animals in people's minds. So our pets are people, they're persons. We see them as integral parts of our family. And then, when you look at the meat on your plate, of course, it doesn't look like an animal. So that disguise helps foster that disconnect, because you're not really seeing the slaughter, you're not seeing the pain, you're not seeing any of that. And if by chance you do encounter that, I agree that would be a much more motivating force for that awakening. But most people never even, now it's more available. But when I remember growing up, who the heck knew what happened to those animals? I had no idea. So when you see the way it's packaged and the way it's sold, it's so disconnected from the reality of what is, that you can get lost in that illusion very easily, that your pet is a real thing and a member of your family. And this piece of meat on your plate is just a piece of meat on your plate. Who knows where it came from? Who knows what it looked like in life? You didn't even question that. So those of us that have taken that next step of understanding that, yeah, there's a major awakening. But I think still in this world, there's still people that just don't wake up to that idea of the difference between, when does the animal become a person and when is it viewed as a thing? And that whole thingness and personhood, that sentientness that's related to animals, is still really disconnected in a lot of people's minds. And I find it remarkable that operates that way in a lot of people. It's mind-bending to me, because I do believe, like you, that the highest ideals of human behavior that are kind of etched in even our gene pool is empathy, compassion, and love. And I really feel that that's really the truth for the highest ideals of human behavior. So we do have that. But yet the job has been such a good job on conditioning a separation from that it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is mind-blowing, because we're so good at being able to choose willful blindness over consciousness. And
Right.
it's supported by everybody. And that's what I mean. And I don't mean this in a conspiratorial way, but everyone supports us staying asleep. We support us staying asleep because we're afraid of what it's going to mean for us. Our partners, our family members want us to stay asleep because they don't know what it's going to mean for them. The industries want us to stay asleep because that's going to affect their bottom line. The government wants us to stay asleep because that means would have to change whole systems, right? I mean, in
Right.
all these ways, we're supported in staying asleep. And yet I would say that it's true that we resist the change and we resist opening our eyes, but I would argue that more people than not are aware, but we just turn away on purpose. So everyone who says, don't show me, don't tell me, I
Right.
don't want to know, I actually look at that as a positive indication that they know that
Right.
if they look, they're going to be compelled to make a change. And
I
it's
see.
the change they're afraid of. So that's why we all just say, look away. And so what you're talking about, the willful blindness that comes in certainly the shape of a thing. It's also the language we use around it, even
Right.
calling it meat, even calling it beef, even calling it, pork. And none of that was done consciously. It was literally the change in the language as French came in and was starting to take over English, literally when English was being formed. So it wasn't conspiratorial that we say beef instead of cow when we're eating the animal.
Right.
But it is now where we are, where you said to someone, what are you eating, a cow burger or you're eating a pig? People would be offended by it because we do use the language to mask what it is we're eating and how we're behaving. So I would agree. It is mind-blowing. And you're right. Millions and billions of people are willfully blind. But I would argue that they're so close to not being willfully blind. That's why we resist looking, because we know if we looked, we're going to change.
I'm here with Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, who's a animal activist and joyful vegan. We're going to take just a short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's Principles of Healthy Living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner, Windstar, is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet, SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs. Attend informative workshops and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and my special guest today is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Yeah, let's talk about that. That's in your own awakening, because, you know, you and I, you're a prolific author. You've done writing, and the written word and books and things can have huge impacts. And I know in your own awakening, there were two major things that provided that impact. One was the encounter with John Robbins' work, and then another was and that was the kind of the beginning of having you help see that whole animal processing industry and the link to problems of health and animal abuse and environment. And then another one, which was even more significant, on slaughterhouses. So talk a little bit about that, because in a way, you're kind of like the female John Robbins with all those ice cream factories in the past, and John coming from his Baskin Robbins ice cream fortune. You know, the fact that it's kind of ironic that he had such a impact at a certain aha moment in your life. So talk about those aha moments for you through that written word and through those texts that really, really hit home the need for you to make a huge change in your life.
Yeah, the difference is the fortune that his father had and the lack of fortune my father had.
Yeah. No, I get that. Yes, I get that.
But it's true. The irony, there's a couple ironies, is also, so when I read Diet for a New America, John Robbins' book, you know, and I always say this to people who find my work and say that they became vegan from my work. I said, no, you're the one who was open enough and willing enough to look. I was the conduit. And so John Robbins was the conduit for me. I opened the book. And it was the first time I had ever read anything about factory farming and industrialized, you know, animal farming. And there were some pictures, you know, kind of in the middle of the book. And I was stunned by what I was reading and by what I saw. And it really was the first awakening for me. It was the first step into this world. The irony is that I continued to consume dairy and I continued to consume eggs, but it was definitely land animals that was the first thing I let go of. And it started me on a journey of kind of looking at more, reading more. I mean, I became an animal advocate right away, even though I was only vegetarian and I continued to consume other animal products. I was starting to look into, you know, puppy mills and vivisection and kind of all these other ways that we exploit animals. And so that was the first foray into that whole world that continues to this day. I mean, that was many, many years ago, decades ago now. And then several years later, and it did take me several years before I was reading other books in between, but it was the book that I picked up called Slaughterhouse. Now, obviously I knew what I was in for. I knew it wasn't a comedy. I knew I was going to read something that was going to be pretty unpleasant, but I really felt pretty strongly that it was my responsibility to bear witness to something I was participating in. I never expected what happened from that book. I mean, I never, ever expected the experience I had. I was reading it during a time when I was working for like a .com. This is very, very on and very early on in the internet. And I was at some tech conference that felt so inane compared to what I was reading about. And I was reading about, so it was an investigative journalist who wrote this book, and she wrote this book instigated by a whistleblower at a slaughterhouse where, you know, it was a USDA plant and they did not have enough inspectors. And so animals were being sent to slaughter in a way that was breaking the Humane Slaughter Act, you know, and that's bare minimum humane slaughter as it is, but there weren't enough inspectors to ensure that the animals were being slaughtered humanely. And so she came in around that story, but she didn't want to be accused of writing about a slaughterhouse that would be deemed as a bad apple. So she decided to ask the same questions and interview slaughterhouse workers across the country, across the United States, and slaughterhouses across the United States. And it was a really impactful way to go about it, because you're getting this cross-section of people from all walks of life and from all different states and from all different slaughterhouses who are answering the same questions the same way. And that was basically that they were doing things to animals that we can't even imagine in our worst nightmares. Beyond the slaughter, it was basically a culture of violence. It is a violence. Slaughterhouses, they are literally characterized by violence. They're characterized by people slaughtering animals, killing animals day in and day out. And so what do you think that does to people? I mean, that desensitizes people to their own compassion. It desensitizes people to the suffering of animals. And that was the horror that I have never forgotten, that's what I was supporting. The slaughter was bad enough. I mean, you can cut up as neatly as you can. You still cannot take away the fact that you are creating a place of such desensitization that was so anathema. And that was just that. I mean, that was it for me. And then, I say I'm vegan, but you may have read this. I something I wasn't. I actually was already compassionate, but it was really hidden, and it was really covered up with all this stuff, all these excuses, all these desires for, kind of status quo, that, I often say I didn't become vegan as much as I removed the blocks to the compassion that was already inside of me. And that image really resonates with me, because it really was like removing all of this muck. And it has been since then, and it's been 25 years, that has just been this like lightness and cleanness. And that doesn't mean I don't get sad or angry, or this is like some perfect, ethereal way of living, but there is no muck. There is no blindness. I can wake up every day and know that I'm at least being as consistent as possible. And that feels so good. And that's why I dedicated my life to this, because I want everybody else to feel this.
Well, the thing about that, and the point, really well made, is that when that becomes an aspect or part of your life, it really becomes your whole life. I mean, it really becomes the philosophical foundation, filters all reality through your perception. And I say that because, you turn people to this lifestyle, your work, your teaching, and I want to talk more about that in a little bit. But, with the videos you do, with the books you write, with the classes that you teach, your goal is to people on to a compassionate way of life, creating a more compassionate, loving world. And, what happens with me, and probably with you, you're attracting people from all different walks of life. So they're maybe not 100%, maybe they're part of that. They're incorporating some small changes. And what me is when I encounter people and I'll talk to someone and they'll say, well, I'm 80% vegan. And I'll say to them, that's great that you're making those changes, but you realize this is a binary situation. You're either vegan or you're not, because the other 10 or 20%, what you're telling me is you're not really embracing a compassionate way of life. It's like saying to me, you're 80% pregnant. You are in a compassionate way of life or you're not. And so to me, I appreciate that. I have to make the incremental changes that they do. But I love when someone says, well, I'm 60% vegan. The rest of the time I do other things. And I'll hammer that home. And so I don't know how you feel about that, but I see it in a very binary way. You either are or you're not, because you can't tell me that I'm living 60% compassionately and 40% I'm not. So I question, why would you not make the choice to complete that process and go 100% compassionate? So how do you feel about that as you work with people who you are dealing with from all different walks of life and coming from really different places where they're making small changes, but maybe moving in this direction? And how do you process that in terms of your own work? Just curiously.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So, I talk a lot about the fact that doing the work that I do, I have to remain unattached to how it's going to impact other people and what they're going to do
Right.
with it, because it's not mine. That's just not my business. My business is what I have to share and what I have to say, and what people are going to do with that is up to them. What I
Mhm.
have found is the more I can give people the tools to ask themselves those questions, like, what's okay with, how far do I want to go? I find that people really do go all the way because they want to be as honest and consistent with themselves as possible. If someone comes to me though and says, I've cut out this, I've cut out that, I'm on. Of course, I encourage them and give
Mhm.
them even more tools and try and break down more barriers that I can. But again, in a way that is going to not have them thinking about me, but have them thinking about them. And like,
Right.
again, are you being authentic to your own values? Are you being true to your own values? I always say, I don't ask people to live according to my values. I'm urging people to live according to their own. And so however I can do that is what I do. But I will say something around the whole vegan 60% or 80% or binary. I will say this, for me, I think where some activists, where I differ with some activists, is I really can get over obsessed with veganism versus what the point of veganism is. So for
Mm.
me, vegan is just a means to the end. The whole point of me being vegan is to live as compassionately and healthfully as possible. I don't want to hurt anyone. And the
Mhm.
best way I have found in my life to ensure that I'm not hurting anyone intentionally is to be vegan, is to not consume animal products or wear animal products, right? But the point isn't to be as vegan as I can be. The point is to be as compassionate as I can be. And the reason I say that is because I think we get a little too hung up on the purity of veganism. And I'm not saying that you're saying that by someone saying that they're 60% versus 100%, but I do think that there's a danger in focusing on being vegan versus on living as compassionately as possible. Because living as compassionately as possible isn't binary. There are degrees of compassion, and there are one person shows compassion and another person shows compassion differently. But the compassion, I feel like is kind of there. You can't really measure it. And yeah, being vegan 100% means not consuming animal products. That's kind of like what it is. But I just want to not worry so much about being vegan. I want them to worry about all the ways, and there's so many ways we can avoid hurting other animals. And once that's your focus, then you can just let go of some little tiny details, like when we get into like way low level discussions where people are like, what about the ingredients in the machinery that was made with the peanut butter that I'm eating? Like, that's the stuff that I think just gets so far away from the whole point of why we're doing this in the first place, that I think it winds up being really intimidating to other people looking from the outside.
I understand that. Well, that wasn't my point. My point was living as compassionately as possible. That was really my point. And I think the point I'm making is that when someone will ascribe to the idea, because it's not, I agree with you, it's not about the label of being vegan. It's about what it stands for. And what it stands for is separating from the inhumanity that operates through many of the cultural norms that really separate us from the true compassion that we need to be expressing. And the truth of the matter is, right now, the house is burning. And this house is burning to such an extent that only compassionate living is going to change. Nothing else is going to change it. There is no other solution other than compassionate living. And so, to me, that's kind of what I'm talking about. And when I'm not really trying to pressure someone into being vegan, but at the same time, I'm also trying to understand how they can embrace really more of a compassionate lifestyle, as you mentioned. And I think that becomes important. So with that in mind, let me ask you a question. How do you personally implement your approach with people? I want to understand it more. So if someone wants to work with you, the cooking classes you do, the kinds of things you offer, you're offering an online approach, or how do you approach and how do you share your work? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed over the years just because the internet has obviously become so much more prevalent. So it was in-person cooking classes in the beginning, lots of tabling, lots of
Right.
face to face, a lot of speaking engagements, and now it's just incorporated a lot more videos. And I mean, I've always kind of done multimedia. I've been doing my podcast for 17 years, so I've always incorporated different kinds of media. But today, it's a mix of all of things, and people, I want to meet people where they're at. So that's why I do cooking. That's why I do lectures. That's why I do books.
So with that in mind, let's take a break here just to talk about where can they find you? Where would they go to learn more about you? What's the URL you want them to go to? Please say it twice and we'll scroll it across the show notes.
Oh, thanks, Frank. Yeah, so joyfulvegan.com is where people can find me. Joyfulvegan.com. And that's also what I use, on Instagram and a couple other social media places.
That's beautiful. Let's moving out that I love that you offer, and that is these joyful vegan trips. I want to talk about that because I think taking people into other cultural perspectives is such a fantastic way to open up our minds and consciousness about the fact that there are many of these changes going on all over the world. And in fact, when you look at ethnic cultures, many of them have been incorporating plant exclusive choices for centuries. So why reinvent the wheel? Why not take advantage of these cultural perspectives? So talk a little bit about the joyful vegan trips and how that came to be and how that operates and what that's all about. Let people know about that.
Yeah, I mean, everything I do is about demonstrating the abundance and joy in living compassionately and demonstrating that there's not deprivation, that there's no reason we should have to feel like we're not getting good enough because we're vegan when we travel, when we go out to eat, whatever it is. And so the trips are an extension of that. I love to travel. I always have. It's been part of my work and my life for as long as I can remember. And I want to experience that. And to your point, it's such a misconception. I mean, I feel like if I could maybe summarize the foundation of my work and kind of how I go about what I do, I would say that it is just debunking myths. It's just busting myths, right? And one of the biggest myths is that, it's hard to travel being vegan because food everywhere is, animal products. As you said, if you go back in any culture, in any cuisine, the foundation of that cuisine is plants. The only time what's happened over the last, 100 years, it's not even that long a time, right? Relative to our being on this planet. In the last 100 years, we have seen just an increase in animal product consumption across the world. And that's only because of industrialization. That's only because of that. But when we travel, we hear this so often from people, from the working with the chefs, we're working with the restaurants. We're eating their food. We're eating their cuisine because that's the basic foundation of their cuisine. It's only when countries and people become more affluent that they want to eat more animal products. That's what happens. And so this whole idea that vegan is more expensive and that it's less expensive to eat, it is such a farce. Animal products have always been a symbol of luxury for as long as we can remember. So that's one of the reasons I do that with the trips. So it demonstrates when we do these trips that there is no lack, that there is no deprivation. I'll use Italy as an example. People are like, how can you go to Italy and not eat animal products? Have you been to Southern Italy? Have you been to Sicily? It is, they subsist on plant foods. Historically, they have, and they still do. And some of that's economics because they've always been poor. In the North, you have a lot more animal products because they've been a lot wealthier and they have land where they can actually graze larger animals. So, some of it's topography, some of it's politics, some of it's, economics. But pizza is a perfect example. The original pizza was a pizza marinara. The original pizza did not have cheese on it. So you go to any restaurant, any trattoria in Italy, and every single menu just has pizza marinara. Here in the United States, you look at you like you have three heads if you want, cheese on your pizza. And so people have this very skewed perspective in the United States and these wealthier countries, because we have been so skewed to think that, Italian cuisine as animal products. That's Italian American cuisine, but that's not, the authentic cuisine, for instance. So it really depends on where we go. We were just in Rwanda. It's the same thing. Rwandans do not eat a lot of meat. Again, a lot of it is economics, but for the most part, they're really basing their diets on foods. That's changing, because as it becomes a more wealthy nation, they want animal products. That's what people
Right.
want, and they become more affluent. So that's the thing we're fighting. And it's really hard, because it's really hard to tell people who've been poor, for generations, that they're not allowed to have the same things that our generation in our country got to have, animal products,
Mhm.
as they demonstrate their wealth. So it's a tricky, and I think education is a big part of it. But obviously, the government and politics and the money that's in the meat and dairy and egg industries and the lobbyists, like, I mean, it's a really tough hill, but we have to keep climbing it, because that's the only way.
Yeah, it's tough because, as you know, and I know, that when these countries that have been more plant exclusive, when they start incorporating those habits of the West, they start developing all the same diseases and all the same problems. So now they have the added dimension of healthcare costs and so on that they never had before, because they've wanted to embrace what they think more affluent countries in the West are doing. So, do you go on all of these particular trips yourself? Are you part of that?
So these trips came about because I was doing this with another travel company. Long story short, I now do these trips with a couple who are very dear friends, who were podcast listeners and became very dear friends. And long story short, they started a travel company called World Vegan Travel. And so they're now building out their travel company to do many, many, including
Nice.
trips without me. So the ones that I do, where I invite my audience or anybody, are called Joyful Vegan Trips, because those are the ones that I'm on. But
Right.
World Vegan Travel is expanding beyond me, which is exactly what the whole point was. So yeah, I go on the ones that I want to go on. I'm not turning into a travel company. My husband and I choose the ones that we want to go on. Yeah.
But the joyful vegan trips, you actually work with an ongoing ship line or cruise line that you've worked with before. How does it work?
Well, World Vegan Travel is the one who handles all the logistics.
Okay, so that's what you do. Okay, so you're connected with
Exactly.
them.
Exactly. I do the hosting. I play the host, and I attract the people through my audience. And World Vegan Travel does all of the logistics.
I noticed that you do, cruelty-free outings, visits to sanctuaries. You do all of that. So that seems like a lot of legwork that you do to organize that. Is that true?
Yes, and again, that is mostly World Vegan Travel that's doing that.
Okay.
We work on things together, but they're the ones, and we do a lot of scouting together. So it's not too rough to scout and go to places, and go to restaurants and travel and go to farm animal sanctuaries. But all of that is what we are committed to, so that it's not just about the food. We do also go to animal sanctuaries, as you mentioned, and we're also there for the cultural aspects as well. It's not like this is a whole cooking tour. Like, we're there for whatever the country is that we're going to
Right.
offers, and we take advantage of that, and then we just make sure the food is fabulous.
So, Colleen, what else is on the horizon for you? What do you have? What things are you working on toward in the future?
Well, right now I'm in the process of proofreading my next book, which comes out in March of 25, and that's called
That's
A Year.
exciting.
It is. It is.
What's the title of this book?
So this one's called A Year of Compassion.
Okay.
52 weeks of living zero waste, plant-based, and cruelty-free. So it's incorporating all the things we're talking about. It's incorporating the consumption of plants and the nutrient-dense aspect of that. It's incorporating all the different ways that we can, avoid cruelty to animals, prevent cruelty to animals. And then it's also a lot of the sustainability aspects as well,
That's
including.
beautiful. So are you already in pre-sales with that? Is that what's happening?
We are. It is officially available for
Yay.
pre-order. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
Yes. I know the process. It's good to get it off the ground. Great. Well, as we wind this down, do you have any final words you would love to share with the audience out here?
We were talking about this. I think we alluded to this. I really do believe, and I've said this a million times, that people, if they think they have to do everything all at once, do nothing at all.
Right.
And so whatever it looks like for you, I would just say to whoever is listening, just don't do nothing, because you can't do everything. Do something, anything. We just wind up using the all or nothing excuse and wind up doing absolutely nothing at
Right.
all. Start where you're at, wherever you can start. People say, well, I could never give up, cheese, but I can give up beef and pork. Fine. Give up beef and pork. Start there, at least, if that's what you're saying you could do. And then I can tell you that very naturally, you will start giving up more things because you're at least started somewhere. But stay open, bear witness, be honest, be curious, and be compassionate. That's what I would say.
Okay. I can't thank my guest, Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, enough for joining us today. I urge you to follow her on the show notes site that's scrolling across the screen. Get involved with her books. Really work on really moving and living that compassionate lifestyle, which really is going to be a salvation for this planet and for all of us. And I really want to thank the people that have joined us today, because without you, we can't do what we do. So I want to thank you for being part of this very active and healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. And I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Colleen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Frank.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.